Okay, so that should now be starting. Right, okay, so welcome then to week 2 of this module, additional learning needs and inclusion. The aim of this morning then, I suppose, similar to last week really. There's a few talky bits, there's a few bits I'm going to set you off and do some kind of discussion bits and feedback onto some Padlets, for example, and I also want to pick up on aspects of the assignment again as well. When we met last week, we did say, all right, this first test is going to happen in March. We're now talking about this test is going to happen next month, so it's not that much closer, but it's getting a little bit closer. And as I said, historically, I'm aware that people sometimes get a bit stressed in terms of this first one, partly because of the kind of the test aspect, and partly because this may be something that you've not done before, in terms of thinking about planning a session. Okay, and there's no expectation that you should have done that before. There's no expectation that you have to be a teacher or a teaching assistant to be able to do this. But if this is something that's particularly new to you, I can understand how that is a bit stressful, and therefore, as I said, we'd kind of spend a bit of time on each session between now and then, just picking up on bits of it to try and reduce stress levels, and as you said, try and make sure you can write as much of this in advance and then think about tweaking it on the day. Okay, so what we're going to look at this morning, if that's right, then we'll start off, we'll just do a quick recap about the assignment. I won't talk about the second one today because that doesn't come in until May, and I think people are relatively happy in terms of that second essay last week anyway. So realistically, you're either thinking about what do we mean by inclusion, which is going to be kind of a focus that's underpinning to some extent what we talk about every week, or you were thinking about the impact of the environment on learners with additional learning needs, and that's the example that I gave you last week that had been submitted previously, where they were thinking about things like the physical classroom environment, the sensory environment, and also thinking about the social environment, friendships, people's perceptions towards learners with needs, for example. Or the third option was thinking about the role of the educator in supporting or not learners with additional learning needs. And we said when we're thinking about educator, we might well be thinking about teachers, but there is a broader group of people we could have under that educator term as well. Teaching assistants, learning support assistants, somebody delivering sessions at a youth club, scouts, brownie leaders, for example. So you can contextualise each of those assignments in all sorts of different ways. And we said that's probably a good thing, but the challenge is there's no one right answer, and you can set it out however you want to. So there is some kind of structure, but at the same point you've kind of got free rein to talk about whatever you want as well. Okay, so both of those kind of have advantages and disadvantages. And then what we're going to think a little bit about this morning are some key debates in relation to additional learning needs and inclusion, and I'm going to set you off in a bit thinking about 2 activities where again there is no right answer. So we've had schools for over 4,500 years now, yet there's no kind of agreement globally as to what schools should look like, how they're set up, what they should deliver, how they should deliver it, who they should deliver it to, for example, and what is the purpose of sending children and young people to school. Okay, so we're going to think about those things to some extent. There's going to be a couple of activities that I'm going to ask you to have a look at after today, if that's okay. Now, what I would say is any of the activities, I suppose, apart from the try and keep going and thinking about setting up your session plan, for example, any of the other activities I'm going to share with you are, you know what, these would be helpful if you have a look at them, but if you don't have time, don't worry about it. Okay, so they are there to potentially extend your thinking a little bit rather than something that you definitely have to do. Alright, so engage with, don't engage with, depending upon what's going on during the rest of the week. Alright, So thinking about the module itself then, so we said last week there was a few things that we were going to talk about. We're going to move on in a couple of weeks' time to think about this fourth point in particular, thinking about the potential impact of a range of different additional learning needs. And this then will focus in particular upon those learners that you might be introduced to for the in-class test. So a learner who has a need such as ADHD, for example, what might be the kind of the root causes of that, what might the impacts on that learner be, and in a kind of education setting, what kind of support or strategies might be helpful. Okay, so we will look at a range of different needs. In particular, we'll focus on cognition and learning needs and think about things like dyslexia and dyscalculia, for example. We'll focus a bit on communication and interaction needs and think about speech and language, but also in a bit more depth, autism, for example. We'll think about those learners where maybe behaviour is challenging or is seen as being a challenge to others, and what might be the potential impacts on that. And to some extent as well, we'll also think a little bit about sensory and or physical impairment. So thinking about those learners who might have a visual impairment compared to somebody who might be a wheelchair user, for example. But we're also going to think a little bit about what do we mean by additional learning needs. Now, we talked about the fact last week very briefly that ALN is very specific to Wales in terms of terminology, so I will be using ALN as we go through. However, we'll look at the definitions and compare that to SEN in England later and see they're almost identical in reality. But when you're thinking about your assignments going forward, you don't have to talk about Wales specifically. You can contextualise this in whatever way you want. So we'll think a little bit about terminology and we'll have a look at things like policy and practice. So as we said then, two assessments for this module, and I think both of these work quite well together in that they assess you in different ways. So the first one very much is thinking about practicalities. So thinking about learners who do have an identified need, what could I do to support? What might be beneficial for that learner? So I think that first one is quite nice in that it kind of makes you think about a learner in an education setting and thinking about potential barriers and strategies. And if you were working with this made-up fictitious learner, how do you think you might support? What might be helpful? And then look in to kind of back that up with evidence from literature and policy as well. Sorry, this has got a mind of its own today. So that first one, very much practical. The second one, then a bit more theoretical. And as we said, you're really here looking at what do we mean by inclusion and what does that look like? And that's something we'll start to see a little bit later on. We don't have a single agreed definition, which means countries do things differently. Or you're looking at how the environment impacts upon learners, or you're looking at how the teacher, teaching assistant, others in a kind of teaching or advisory or instructory type role impact on learners. The only difference I would say between them is that if you pick the first essay option, which is looking at inclusion, then inclusion is much broader than just ALN. So inclusion means all learners, and maybe sometimes you forget a little bit about those learners who might experience challenges from other ways in terms of things like poverty or disadvantage or geographical location, or depending on certain parts of the world, kind of gender, ethnicity, sexuality, for example. So that first essay option about inclusion gives you broader scope, perhaps in terms of what challenges you might want to talk about. The second and third one do have much more of a focus on ALN. Okay, so just going to come off that PowerPoint for a second and go back to the assignment guidance page on Canvas. So there was two of these pages. We looked at these last week. This is kind of the first one, introducing the in-class test and giving you an overview as to what it is you'll be doing on the day. And then what we said was you were going to be planning a one-off lesson plan for a fictitious class of your choice on any topic you want, as long as it seems to make sense and is applicable for the age range that you've said you were going to work with. You're going to bring your session plan with you on the day, and every week between now and then you've got the chance to kind of bring it with you when you've had the chance to look at it, in terms of getting some feedback, in terms of, is it on the right lines, does it seem sensible? And we said then that in addition to the session plan, you were going to have a justification as to how you said you were going to do your activities, for example. So were you going to use a teaching assistant? How were you going to set people up in groups? Were you taking people outdoors? Were you going to give people access to different types of technology? So no right answers in terms of doing any of it, but can you justify the approaches that you were going to use? And we said this justification then is 1,000 words, and probably 700 of those words you can do in advance before you come. So realistically, in my session, I am going to be splitting learners up into 3 different groups. One of those groups is going to be supported by a teaching assistant, and the other 2 groups will work independently. Okay, so straight away that's entirely fine. 2 things you can start to justify there, thinking about pupil groupings. So how are you setting people out in groups, and why are you using a teaching assistant to support, and what are they going to be doing? Okay, so last week we had a look at an example of a session plan and justification with some redacted bits. So there's a bit more redaction, like the Epstein files in the 2 that I've given you today. So this one from last week was looking at kind of cooking and linking this to World War II, thinking about that Lord Woolton pie. And this person had said that the class that they'd made up was year 6, which was mixed ability, and there was 30 children in the group. And what you can see then on that session plan from last week was there were bits that had been blacked out all the way through it. Those blacked out bits basically linked to the learners and what they'd put in specific to them. So Tia, you're only seeing this morning, for example. So you can see this is the one from last week. Those blacked out bits were basically what they'd added on the day for the learner. The rest of it they'd planned and prepared in advance and brought it with them. Alright, so I've given you 2 others this morning. And the reason why I've given you 2 others, these also scored in the 70s as well. So all 3 that I've given you were good. They scored in the distinctions. They're all different. They've set it out slightly differently. The only thing they've got in common is that they follow the same session template. Okay, and you've all got access to this template. It's there at the bottom of that assignment guidance page, for example, on Canvas. Okay, so if we look at, let's have a look at the one that's got the student teacher, Mrs. X. This one was looking at Pancake Day, and they were thinking about what is Pancake Day, why do we have it, and she talked about the fact that she was going to get some art, cooking, literacy and numeracy in there. She'd made this year 2 class up, so they were going to be a mixed ability class of children aged 6 to 7 years. Okay, and then she's followed kind of the same pattern through as the one we looked at last week. Now if you look at this one thing that stands out perhaps in this one is that they didn't add anything specific about those learners onto the lesson plan itself. However, when we get to the justification at the end, you can see that this one is a little bit more heavily blacked out than the one from last week. So realistically, the one we looked at last week did the lesson plan, did some of the justification, and updated both bits of it during the day. This second one pretty much went, I'm happy with my lesson plan, I'm not changing that at all, but what they did was go into a bit more detail in terms of the different learners that they were talking about. Okay, now the one that we looked at last week followed the same kind of pattern as this one, in that they'd woven the 3 different learners into different bits in the justification. Okay, and as we said last week, that's one way of doing it. It's not the only way, but it is a way. The second one I've given you today then, this one is all in bold for some reason, but this one was looking at a year 1 class. They've said, so they were mixed ability, aged 4 and 5, and you can see on here what they were looking at this time. They were trying to teach children about different shapes. So what's a triangle, what's a circle, and what's a square. Okay, so seems appropriate for 4-year-olds to be learning in class, for example. You will see there is a little bit of redaction on the session plan itself. So they have thought about bringing in specific bits about the 3 learners, but again, most of it they'd gone, I've planned that in advance and it's entirely fine. And then if you look at the justification bit, realistically you've got that first page there, which is a little bit more theoretical. So this is what they've done in advance. So realistically, this is why I was doing scaffolding, this is why I've used teaching assistants, for example. And then if you flip over, what they then did basically was a paragraph based on each of the 3 learners. Okay, and what they've done is kind of linked to the needs and interests and strengths of the learner and tried to justify how what they've done in their lesson plan fitted those needs. Okay, so slightly different way of structuring the same type of information. As I said, I just wanted to show that there were different ways you could put this together, as we said last week. So realistically, on the 9th of March, you will bring your lesson plan with you. You've got between now and then to work on it bit by bit when you get some time to think about it. Each week as we go through, we'll have some time at the end if you want to go over anything, or if you want to send it to me by email to take a look at, for example. I'm also happy to kind of meet up outside of class time if there's anything you want to go over about it as well. So you will have done the session plan, you will have done about 70% of your justification, and then as we said, on the day itself, you bring all that with you. I will share something with you on Canvas that you won't be able to see until the start of the test, and what you will see in particular is 3 examples of profiles for the learners you're going to meet on the day. Now, I showed you an example of one last week, which is Dennis. There's 2 others here that you can kind of take a look at as well. So realistically, Dennis we looked at last week. I think Dennis, we'd said, had autistic spectrum disorder, for example. We've got another learner here, Caris. Again, these are all made up. So Caris's 1-page profile, so this is basically what she said she likes. So she likes going swimming, she likes listening to quiet, relaxing music, she likes getting out and about, she likes support for her communication. So there might be some bits and pieces there that might be helpful if Caris was one of the learners that you'd met. Okay, now you're probably not going to be able to go, well, we were doing a lesson on history, but Caris can go to the swimming pool to do it. Okay, that's helpful to know about Caris, but I think that's probably a little bit difficult to include. However, there might be something there in terms of the relaxing music, for example. So maybe Caris gets during busy environments, therefore she has the opportunity to put headphones on and listen to music to calm down while she's working, for example. So that could be a nice accommodation. That might be something that you put into your session plan. Or if you're doing an outside lesson. Now, Caris does have some physical needs as a result of cerebral palsy. She is able to walk, however she finds that difficult when she's outside. So if one of the learners was Caris, and it won't be Caris, but if one of your learners was Caris and you'd said you were doing kind of an outdoor forest school session, you might need to think about how you could ensure that it was wheelchair accessible. So you might note in your fictitious school with your fictitious class that the forest schools do have wheelchair accessible paths, for example. Therefore, Caris will be able to get there using her wheelchair. Equally, you didn't know that Caris is going to be in your class until the day maybe your outdoor space doesn't have that wheelchair accessible space, but maybe there is another way or a different type of activity you could get Caris to be involved in whilst she's outside. Alright, and then the second part of that then gives a little bit more information specifically about their additional needs. So this one, for example, talks about the fact she finds it difficult to hold a pen, she finds it difficult to handwrite. So if you were doing quite a literacy heavy session, for example, might you want to make sure that Caris has access to an iPad, for example, to type up on? Or maybe rather than that, you might go, well, actually Caris can use speech-to-text software instead. Or maybe, do you know what, she's happy working with a teaching assistant and she verbalises her answers to the teaching assistant who writes it on their behalf. Now all of those are fine. Okay, in your justification you would just basically say why you've picked that approach. Okay, so that's an example of Caris, and then this one is Jenny. So again, a little bit different in terms of how it's presented. So this is kind of Jenny talking about herself. So she likes people seeing that she's determined. She likes to try and help people. So thinking about, for example, giving Jenny jobs in the classroom potentially as a way to get her engaged, or maybe thinking about how you group your learners. If she likes to be helpful, could that be used to support Jenny herself? She doesn't like being controlled by other people. She does like being listened to, for example. She likes Holby City. Don't know if that helps particularly much in terms of the session that you're going to plan. She doesn't like people shouting at her or interrupting her. Sometimes she just needs a bit of space. So again, you might be thinking about, well, we were going to do some group work today. Now Jenny's coming in. Jenny, as we can see here, has autistic spectrum disorder. She is okay working with people most of the time. However, at times she does need her own space to kind of go and regulate her feelings. So how could that be incorporated in the session? All right. And again, just here, for example, Jenny currently has asthma, so maybe if you were doing something quite strenuous outdoors, that might be something that you need to take into consideration. Now, what I would say in terms of these, the ones you'll get on the day will look very similar. There's no expectation that you have to take note of everything that's on there. Okay, so I would say realistically pick out key interests that you could bring into the classroom, pick out some of the potential key barriers or challenges, and think about how those could be overcome. All right. So any particular questions in terms of that? I suppose realistically it's a case of going through and deciding what age group your made-up class is going to be, how you want that class to look. And as we've seen with these learners, there is no age attached to these. So this could be, like we've seen, a year 1 group, this could be a year 6 class. Equally, people did this saying this was a level 4 class in university, for example. So they're not age specific. Okay, so hopefully that helps. As I said, those kind of IDP examples are at that bottom of the assignment guidance page, and the session plan template is on there as well. Okay, so have a bit of a think about what you want your class to be and what you might want to teach them, and then when you're ready to kind of check it's okay, just let me know and we'll go through that. Alright, so as I said, the aim is you'll have done your session plan, you'll have done about 70% of the justification, you'll have had some feedback on it before you turn up on the Monday, and then on the Monday you get given 3 new learners, and you're looking at what you've planned and gone, yeah, that works for Caris, and it works for Caris because, or didn't realise Dennis was coming in, Dennis has got a challenge that I might need to think about, and for Dennis I would do this because. Okay, so that's where we're going with that one. And as I said, in terms of the session plan itself, there is no word limit on that. The justification though is limited to 1,000 words. Alright, and as a reminder, we don't have the plus or minus 10% leeway. If it's, a handful of words over 1,000, I wouldn't worry about it, but try and stick to the 1,000 if we can. Alright, so any questions on that, or are you thinking just shut up about it and let's move on?
Will there be an invigilator? I know that's actually a really stupid question.
No, that's an excellent question, Jess. No, realistically there won't be.
Okay.
No,
so it'll just be us.
So it'll just be us. Yeah, so hopefully there'll be 5 of you and me, and we will be in the computer room if we're able to get one. If not, it might be we're in here using the device that you've got, and then basically you will, I suppose, have to spread out slightly. There'd be kind of you need to do this without talking type bit as we go through, but it'll be really informal. So it's a bit like this really, for an hour and a half with you just getting on with something. And at the end of it, you upload it to a submission point on Canvas as normal. So we're not in an exam room, we don't have an invigilator, so bring in drinks, snacks, as, usual. If you work well listening to music, bring headphones with you, whatever makes sense on the day, and it will be as informal and non-exam-y as we can make it.
Thank you.
Alright? Yeah, it gets a bit stressful otherwise if it was under those really strict conditions.
I just picture like what we was having,
Yeah, no, that makes sense, Jess. It's good to know. Okay, so hopefully that helps a little bit. So that's where we're going in terms of the first assessment, and as I said, that's 25% of the module. And what I would say historically, people have done pretty well on this one. In the this is my 4th year delivering the module now. I've never had anyone who's failed in terms of that, and there's never been any real difference in the quality in terms of whether people have been teachers or not, or whether people have had experience working in school or not. So I know sometimes people have been a little bit worried, going, well, the only time I've ever had experience in school was when I was a pupil myself. I've never done this before, am I going to be at a disadvantage? Hopefully the answer is no. And as I said, we've got another, 5 weeks before we're doing this, so you'll have multiple opportunities to get as much feedback as you want. Okay. So moving on then, so what we're going to start to think a little bit about today are some key debates in relation to ALN and inclusion. And as we go through the module, I've already said the phrase a couple of times today and last week, I suppose, there is no one right answer. There is no one right approach to anything that meets the needs of all learners, who are all coming with their own individual strengths and challenges and experiences, for example. But when we're thinking about inclusion in ALN, more specifically, there are a number of different things that people don't agree on. So, for example, what do we mean by inclusion, and then how do we do inclusion? Okay, so when you start to look at the literature on this, I will show you some examples a little bit later on. Some people talk about it very much as being based just on placement. So unless you go to a particular type of education setting, everything else is exclusion. Equally, other definitions don't mention placement at all, and some of them talk about it being a process, so it's something that's ongoing. Others talk about it as being a destination. So we've done this, therefore this is the outcome. One of the biggest debates, I suppose, is where learners with needs should be taught. So should this be in the same school as other learners? Should this be in the same classroom as other learners? Equally, is it appropriate to teach some learners in different settings? Okay, now I am quite ambivalent about a lot of these things, and my answer again is vague. I don't think there is one right answer, and it depends on the learner, but a lot of debate does happen in terms of that kind of placement aspect. We'll then think a little bit later on about labels, and are there advantages and disadvantages of having a label, and if so, does it depend on the label itself? We'll think a little bit about perceptions, so what do people think about those particular labels and how does that influence the individual? And then as we move through, we'll think a little bit about where the process of identification and assessment fits in. So should we be assessing learners and identifying needs and giving them a label before we start to put support in place, or actually is it too late at that point? And should we start to be thinking about support right from the very beginning, and whether that learner engages with that support and whether that support is beneficial? Could that be part of the assessment process itself? And then we'll also think a little bit over the coming weeks as well about what, if any, say learners and their families should have in terms of support. And I think in education historically we've been quite guilty in terms of doing things to children and young people. One of the key principles underpinning the legislation in Wales is learner autonomy and voice, and ensuring that we do things with learners and their families rather than to learners and their families. So I'm going to give you a break from my voice shortly, and we're going to do a couple of Padlets this morning, and this is the first one. And when we open these up shortly, you will see that there is quite a few columns on here today. Realistically, first thing I'm going to ask you to think a little bit about is school. Okay, now we've all been to school. We've all been to school in different contexts. So some of us went to school in Wales, some of us went to school in England, some of us went to small primary schools, some of us might have gone to a large, more urban secondary school, for example. Some of us might have gone to an FE college rather than sixth form. But we all kind of have an understanding of what a school is. So if I was going to ask you, Jess, what's a school? I don't want you to answer, but you've got an idea in your head as to what I mean when we're talking about a school. So you've probably got an image, you would be able to describe it in some way. Okay, so what we're going to think about as we go through really is schools themselves and the impact of schools and how they work and how they're set up in terms of inclusion. And I've just put some questions that I've got off Google here in particular. So when we think about schools, we tend to think that schools are appropriate and they work for everyone, because realistically schools have been around, as I said, for about 4,500 years, therefore they must be correct. They must be doing things right. Schools have always been like they are today, or have they? Schools are like that everywhere, or are they? Schools must meet the needs of all learners, or do they? And then one of the things I'm going to ask you to think a little bit about as well is, as you move through those different stages of school, how do they change? So thinking about primary schools, for example, what's different to primary schools and how you're taught, for example, and your experiences compared to secondary schools? How does that change again then if you go from secondary school to FE college or to university, for example? So you're still being engaged within education. So in theory we're doing the same thing, but it looks different and it's delivered differently, and your experiences in it and what you're expected to do within it are different. Okay, so I'm just going to open up this Padlet link. So, famous last words. On the Padlet, the QR code should work. The Padlet link should work, but also I've put this up onto the additional learning resources page for this week as well, if you wanted to just open it straight up from there. Okay, so there's 4 of you in today. We could do this individually, or we could do it as one group, or we could do it as 2 groups of 2, entirely whatever works for you. But what I'd like you to have a go at doing is just popping some thoughts down underneath each of these columns. Now, as I said, there is quite a few on here. So the first one, how would you define a school? Okay, so without looking at a definition in an online dictionary, what would you say a school is? Now, most of the time when we do this, I would say most people, myself included, would think about, it's a building or a place that people go to learn, for example. However, since the COVID pandemic, does school just mean a physical location? Okay, we're starting to see a massive increase in virtual education and virtual schools, for example. Okay, so how would you define the school? Secondly, I'd like you to think a little bit about what sort of indoor and outdoor facilities would you suggest a school has. Now, this might vary and some might not be available in all compared to some. So not every school has its own swimming pool, for example, for PE sessions. However, all schools have a responsibility to teach that, therefore there would be access to a local authority pool very often. So what sort of indoors and outdoor facilities would you expect schools to have? The third one then, how are schools organised and how do schools group learners? Okay, now there are all sorts of different ways in which schools work globally, but there are also some similarities as well. And we do tend to split schools up into different sectors. So most countries have a combination of primary and secondary schools. However, thinking about parts of England, for example, you've got primary, middle and secondary, okay, which is very common in parts of America in particular as well. Parts of Wales, for example, especially more rural areas, we're moving towards all through schools. So 3 to 16, or in some cases 3 to 18 schools. So children right across that school age span together in the same campus, although it's still got that primary and secondary split. So how are schools organised? And then within schools, how do we group learners? So do we have mixed ability? Do we have set by ability? The most common thing that's done in most schools is organise learners by age. In other words, if you were born between the 1st of September one year and the 31st of August the year after, you will be together in the same class. Okay, is that appropriate? Okay, now my birthday is the 27th of August. I was 11 and a half months younger than some of the people in my class in school. Okay, if I was born a couple of days later, I'd have been the oldest person in the year below. Alright, so is splitting children up by age always appropriate, for example? I'd like you to think a little bit about what sort of barriers do schools face. Okay, now we've all seen things in the news, we've all experienced cost of living crisis, for example. Everything is more expensive than it used to be. Okay, so what are some of the barriers that schools face? So could be funding, could be resources, could be staffing. Equally, it could be to do with the kind of different catchment areas. Okay, so all sorts of things in the news when the Labour government came in, for example, talking about putting VAT on private school fees. So those challenges schools like Eton, for example, might be experiencing is a barrier. However, those barriers might be very different compared to the primary school on the Gurnos estate in Merthyr, for example. Okay, so barriers might be contextual. This next one, how do schools change as you move from primary to secondary and then from secondary into further or tertiary education? So thinking about when you were in primary school, for example, learning through play quite often, quite fluid. You spent most of your time with the one teacher for the year. As you go into secondary school, you got different subjects taught by discrete subject teachers. Thinking about not necessarily our group, but if you were doing kind of undergraduate economics or psychology potentially, you might be, bless you, in a lecture theatre with 400 other people, with one person at the front spouting information at you that you're expected to take on board. Very different to what secondary and primary school looks like. And then the final question, this is quite vague and quite open. And globally, what do schools have in common and how do they differ? Now, there's all sorts of ways in which schools differ, and this might be in relation to culture or economics, for example, but there are some similarities as well. And there are similarities, for example, in terms of governance. So in most countries globally, there is some government oversight to schools and how they work and what they teach, for example, and who's allowed to teach. But in some cases, there might be more authority given to local authorities, for example. If you want to teach in America, for example, there is an individual license to teach in each of the different states in America. So if you trained to be a teacher in Florida, that means you can teach in Florida. However, if you wanted to move to Oregon, for example, your teaching license isn't valid. So you would need to do a different one. And then thinking about ways in which schools are different. So it could be different starting ages. Okay, so the most common age globally that children start school formally is 6 to 7. However, in other parts of the world it is younger. So all children in the Netherlands, for example, start school on their 4th birthday. So rather than starting on the 1st of September, realistically you would start your formal education on whenever your 4th birthday fell. Thinking about some countries enforce school uniforms, some don't. Some countries education is free at the point of delivery compared to others where it's all kind of paid for. All countries seem to have a curriculum. Okay, what is taught, however, that might differ. Okay, so France, for example, quite famously, very secular curriculum. Okay, so don't teach religion or religious values, for example, in state schools in France. All sorts of things we've seen in the press recently about schools in France looking to ban the burqa, for example, because that's a religious item and schools are meant to be non-religious organisations. Thinking about how boys and girls are taught, if they're taught. Do we have vocational as well as academic pathways? What do we do in terms of learner support? Okay, if we start school at 4, 5 or 6, for example, when do you finish school? Okay, now again, that seems to vary. Okay, some parts of the world it can be as low as 12, in other parts of the world it is 18. How do we assess learners is different. Okay, even things like the length of the school day. So in parts of the world the school day is about 5.5, 6 hours long. So if you think about most schools in the UK, we're looking at kind of 9 till 3:30 roughly as being the school day. However, some parts of the UK have trialled staggered school days, for example, especially in secondary school, where they've realised that, you know what, if you are a teenager, then your brain works slightly differently and you have a different natural rhythm to how your day works compared to a 11-year-old. So schools in parts of Nottingham, for example, have introduced a 9 AM start for years 7, 8 and 9, but a 10 AM start for those learners in doing GCSEs or sixth forms, for example, which then also means kind of a staggered end to the day. Okay, so all sorts of different ways that schools can differ. So I will stop talking for a few moments now and see what you pop up on there. Thank you very much for posting so far. Jess, you shall forever be known as the Dapper Mongoose. I do like that. I don't think I've seen that one before. That's good. Yeah. Thanks, Flo. That's a nice point about league tables. Yeah. Yeah. Kind of devil's advocate, see why they came in, but incredibly counterproductive.
And there's so many. I feel like they could be taken advantage of, like the whole thing can be taken advantage of some of the high socio-economic class.
Yeah.
Like it's just very competition market based.
It is. It almost goes back to that kind of old 11 plus, and if you,
Grammar schools and stuff.
yeah.
Yeah.
If you come from a wealthy family, well then, these are your opportunities. Now, I don't like Michael Gove as a person, or I don't like anything about him, but I think he said a very true phrase when he was in government, and he said something along the lines of, it is a tragedy in the UK that rich, thick kids will always do better than poor, bright kids. And that was his terminology, but unfortunately, there's a lot of truth in terms of that.
It's really like awkward as well. Like me and my brother are the oldest out of all our cousins, but they're all like their parents are really pushing them. They're like like Buckinghamshire and stuff. So
Okay.
They do the 11 plus, and they're like, oh, you don't get in the 11 plus schools or grammar schools, you could do really horribly. Me and my brother are like, like we're fine.
Yep.
We've done okay. It's like, doesn't matter.
No, but there is another, some parts of the UK do still have that selection. Lots of schools in Northern Ireland, for example, still have that selective entry. Realistically, how many children are put on a particular path before their 11th birthday? Children learn and develop at different rates.
It reproduces, I feel like, grammar schools and things like that, I feel like it reproduces, societal inequalities and stuff like that. Because my boyfriend went to a grammar school in Buckinghamshire, and so did his sister, and oh my god, he looks down on me, and everyone else who went to a normal school. Honestly, it's actually crazy.
Yeah, no.
He honestly thinks and all of them, all of his friends, lots of people I've spoken to in that area, are on this high horse because they went to grammar school. It's like, your parents didn't pay for you to go there.
No.
If I had the opportunity to go to one, I think I would have been able to get it.
Yeah.
But there's just no opportunity.
I think private schools are another level of that though, aren't they? You can smell someone if they went to a private school.
You can smell that and smell
Yeah, 100%. Just the way that they carry themselves. I find it really hard. I find it so No.
Okay, so I'm just going to pick out some key things on this as we go through. So how would you define a school? So a location of learning, gaining skills regardless of age or ability. Okay, so we've got a place children attend to develop cognitive, emotional, social skills. Okay, so similarities. So it's a space learning takes place. Students gain new skills, develop existing skills, regardless of age or ability. Okay, space where children have the opportunity to learn and develop. Okay, so it's a place, it's a location, it's a space that's physical and or virtual, that is something to do with developing skills, developing knowledge. It's not just academics, there's other things that are taking place as well. And that key thing that came across, I think, through all of them, it's all children regardless of age and ability, or at least in theory it should be. Okay, so thinking a little bit then about indoor and outdoor facilities. So this might depend very much, bless him, on different parts of the world and whether it's kind of fee paying or not, for example, but we would expect classrooms. Okay, communal spaces, outdoor playground, library, staff rooms, pastoral rooms. Okay, so we've got spaces for learning, spaces for eating, we've got spaces for kind of more extracurricular activities linked to sport and music, libraries, playgrounds, sensory rooms, really helpful in many schools, staff rooms, canteen and dinner hall. Okay, so a recognition that there is a place both for staff and also for learners. Okay, so potentially swimming pools, sports facilities, technology facilities. Okay, now I am of an age when I can remember going through secondary school and remember the computer, the single computer being wheeled into the classroom rather than, and then I suppose that kind of went to each school had its own computer room. Today, do we have a situation where all classrooms now have access to technology? So those kind of things change. Okay, so that's a nice point in terms of spaces within classrooms. So maybe we've got bits for individual learning, we've got bits for group learning, there's practical bits, there's messy bits. And then, yeah, so again, range. So that's a good point there in terms of kind of toilet and hygiene facilities. Should these be accessible? Yes. Are they always accessible? No. Challenges, I think, in a lot of new build schools in Wales where we've seen things where we've had kind of non-gender specific bathrooms. Okay, that's been a massive area of debate in many schools. What kind of impact has that had? Has it been positive? Has it been negative? That's quite a hot potato, for example, in terms of debate. And that's nice as well in terms of outdoor spaces, thinking like, does your school have any outdoor space at all? Does it have green space? Does it have kind of garden space? Does it have sensory outdoor space? Does it have links to kind of forest schools or woodland areas? Is that space open and available to the wider community? Okay, are schools just there for children between 9 and 3:30, Monday to Friday, 40 weeks a year, for example? Thinking about schools are organised, okay, so mostly by age, within age, especially in secondary schools can be organised by ability or choice of subjects. Okay, so we'll think about that a bit more in a few weeks' time in terms of if we are using ability grouping, what ability are we looking at? Okay, and my experience, I think, when I was in school was it tended to look just at English and maths, and based on those you would be in kind of an ability set for everything depending upon those two parts. All right, is that appropriate? I would say no. Are there challenges in terms of, well, you're in that particular set, you will always be in that set regardless of what you do, especially if you're in a lower ability group, for example. How do we do that kind of up and down movement between sets? Okay, so sometimes grouped by age, sometimes by ability. Yeah, so often in terms of age, regardless of abilities. What we will see possibly next week when we think about special schools, for example, is it always by age? In some cases it might be kind of mixed age but similar academic level or interest, for example. When we think about really small primary schools, so speaking to somebody who works in a 60-child primary school the other day, talking about the fact that they don't have individual year groups, so realistically they've got years 1, 2 and 3 together in one class and years 4, 5 and 6 together in another class. So it's still grouped by age to some extent, but it's a bit wider. Okay, so barriers, so challenges in relation to kind of catchment area, socioeconomic disparities. Okay, challenges in terms of funding, high turnovers of staff. Okay, whether staff feel supported, whether there is enough training, what is or isn't appropriate within the curriculum. Thinking about one of the other big changes we've had in Wales is the curriculum for Wales and moving towards those areas of learning rather than necessarily discrete subjects. You know, I can remember about 12 years ago now being... Good morning. How are you? Good. Being... It's okay, no problem. You're here now. Do you want to kind of sit and join in? I can remember being quite severely told off about 12 years ago in school, the teaching history, because I spent a term teaching about women's history and thinking about why do we always focus on famous men from the past and what place do women have, for example. I was very, very badly told off by that because that's not on the curriculum and I shouldn't have been teaching those things. Okay, so what's on the curriculum can be a challenge. League tables, I think that's a really interesting one. That was yours, Flo, wasn't it, in terms of that? So again, kind of Michael Gove, I think, brought that in terms of trying to ensure that schools upped their game to try and meet the needs of all learners, but not all learners are equal. Okay, now I remember my first year starting in teaching was in a secondary school up in North Wales. My head of department was a really nice man. He ended up going on to become the Senko of the school. But when I started in the geography department, I remember he was kind of working out what classes we were going to have. And his phrase was, I can't be bothered to teach anyone who isn't going to get at least an A. He said, I will take those groups, and his phrase was, you can take the Mongs and the Drongs, which I thought was really interesting at the time. But that kind of perception that some learners were better than others. Okay. Realistically, every year his classes came out with A's and A stars. Mine didn't, because I very often had those learners who were on the CD boundary and tended to do relatively well in terms of that. However, when you kind of compared our results together, was he doing better than I was? Or would his learners have got A stars whether he was there or not, for example? And similar things happen in terms of school league tables as well. Okay, if there's a perception that there is a school that's doing particularly well compared to other schools, do we start to see parents trying to take their children from one school into another? Equally, what is it we're measuring in terms of those league tables? Are we missing out on things that are really important? Within league tables, although we don't have them in Wales anymore, did we measure things like how happy children were? No. Did we measure whether those children felt a sense of belonging? No. Did we measure whether those children enjoyed going to school and their needs and interests were being supported? No. What we did measure was how well children did on standardised tests at various times in the school year. Are those fair? In one sense, well, everyone's doing the same thing, but is everyone appropriately supported and developed to be able to do those in the same way? No. Okay, so that was a nice point, Flo. Thank you for sharing that one. Okay, so Alex, yeah, low funding, low staff numbers. We're seeing that increasingly in schools in Wales in terms of things like having to get rid of teaching assistants, for example. Okay, now I'm a school governor. At one point, about 18 months ago, the school was doing really well as a primary school. It had a surplus in its budget of £130,000. It happened to be the year where the electricity prices shot up. So in June, they had £130,000 in the bank. In November, they were on minus 36,000 because the cost of utilities just went through the roof. Okay, they went, well, we've got no money. The local authority went, we've got no money either. Tough. So what do they end up having to do? They had to get rid of a teacher and teaching assistants. Okay, so funding can be a challenge. Lack of training or poor training. Okay, so you mentioned earlier on about some schools maybe have got harder catchment areas than others. So you might have seen schemes in England, for example, like Teach First, which is a route into teaching where they kind of target people who've got 2-1s and first class degrees to go and teach in particular challenging settings. So in places like Tower Hamlets in London, for example, there was all sorts of bursaries in terms of, well, you know what, if we can get these really qualified people to come in and teach, maybe that will help boost results and attainment in parts of the country which is often quite disadvantaged. Okay, so again, funding, resources, buildings. Okay, how many of you went to school? I know I did, in terms of a building that was built in Victorian times. Okay, so suitable at the time. It was a lovely building, but is it fit for purpose in 2026? Okay, staff burnout. Okay, we'll think a bit in a few time about the pressures of being a teacher or a teaching assistant, all the different things that you were expected to do. How much of that are you able to kind of carry before you go, do you know what, I can't do this anymore? I was reading something last week, for example, which talked about the Teacher Wellbeing Index in the UK for 2025, which talked about that teachers are the most depressed profession. I couldn't think of the word then. Teachers are the most depressed profession in the UK, and teachers have a vastly higher rate of depression, stress and anxiety than the general public, and one of the lowest aspects of well-being in terms of professions as well. Okay, so is this to do with some of the barriers and challenges that we're facing? Safeguarding, that was a good point. And then again, we've got training, numbers of staff, teachers' views, parental views and engagement. That can be an issue both ways, potentially. So thank you very much for sharing those. Okay, moving then from different types of education, from going from your primary school into a secondary school and then maybe going further. So what changes? Okay, so tends to be, as you go up through education, the schools get bigger in terms of numbers. So the average primary school size in Wales, I think, is about 200 learners. The average secondary school size in Wales is about 1,000 learners. Okay, different parts of the UK, that might be very different. Okay, so there are more people in your class as you get older, or more people in your school. As you move into secondary school, perhaps you've got a bit more choice in terms of choosing subjects. However, is that still the case in terms of things like budget cuts, for example? I know when my son was in the sixth form, the local authority were deciding to shut all the sixth forms down in the local area and make people do in certain A-level choices go to the local FE college instead. So he spent half his week back and forth on a taxi between two different settings doing different subjects. Does that also link to availability of staff to be able to teach certain subjects as well? I think that's a really interesting point. When you get to the end of primary school, you are the oldest person, excuse me, or you are the oldest children in that school. Therefore, you have a certain experience. You then start again when you were very much the youngest people when you move into secondary school. And there is, I would say, a really big difference between being in a school as an 11-year-old and also being there as an 18-year-old, potentially. So those social dynamics are really interesting. Tend to have more pupils, tend to be busier, potentially more autonomy for learners, potentially more choice, potentially more extracurricular activities. Bigger schools, potentially with more staff, with more money, with more resources, therefore we can put more on for learners. Okay, that's a good point, thank you very much. And then thinking about globally, what do schools have in common and how do they differ? So maybe different emphasis. So maybe we are still seeing schools as being that place for learning and development, but what's the emphasis on? So some parts of the world have more practical vocational learning. Personally, I think that's a huge gap we have in secondary schools in the UK. Go to school in Germany, for example, there is kind of a key stage 4 vocational pathway, which we don't tend to have. Many of you may well have done A-levels or B-Techs, for example. Has anybody heard of T-levels? These were seen as being kind of more technical, vocational-based equivalents to A-levels. So seen as being an A-level equivalent, if you did a T-level qualification in something, it was the same as getting an A-level in something. However, not many people know about them. Therefore, they don't have as high a status. People that are applying for universities going, well, I've done these T-levels, and some universities are going, what the hell are those? Or people that are applying for jobs, and I've done a T-level and this, and again, well, what is that? I don't know what it means. Okay, so possibly different emphasis, different days. So a certain age, so hopefully taught by a more knowledgeable other, somebody who is older. We'll think in a few weeks' time potentially as well about what the kind of the qualifications needed to be a qualified and or a trained teacher in different parts of the world, because those vary. Traditionally still take place in a building outside of home. Increasingly, potentially, we're seeing in the UK, in Wales specifically, increase in elective home education. Okay, in some cases that's kind of been a hangover from the COVID pandemic. In some cases it's because parents have made a choice. In some cases that choice has been because there's been no other choice. And actually it isn't a choice in the sense it's almost enforced because there's nothing else available. That's a really good point. It focuses on development, but what matters might matter to specific context, and how it's developed and how it's delivered is different. So stereotypically, for example, schools in Asia focus very much on discipline and rote learning and memory. So being taught facts that you can remember and regurgitate back. When we think about kind of Western education, there's a lot more in terms of creativity and problem solving, for example. So different skills being taught, but learners still developing. Okay, differences in relation to religion and culture, influence of politics and government, who's allowed to go to school or not. So thinking about what's happening in Afghanistan at the moment, for example, I think the Taliban have come out recently and said all girls are now banned from all education. Parental involvement. And then, different school starting age. So does that have an impact? If you start formal learning when you're 4 compared to when you're 7, are you appropriately equipped to start formal learning at 4? Should that happen when you are slightly older? Might be differences in terms of leaving age. Different school layouts. Length of the school day. So we mentioned that earlier on. Most schools in the UK finish about 3:30, 4 o'clock, for example. However, if you went to school in South Korea, the school day is very often 14 to 16 hours in length. So very, very different to what we have in the UK. The term calendar, great. So most countries still do that kind of academic year, September to August, but not everywhere. Increasingly starting to see in universities and some FE colleges, for example, doing a calendar rather than an academic year. Thinking about things like school holidays. Okay, so my wife's from Northern Ireland, for example, and then moved to Wales when she was in secondary school. Never had half terms in Northern Ireland. However, they broke up for the summer at the beginning of June. So different ways in terms of how schools are delivered. Fab. So thank you very much for sharing those points. So all sorts of things that we've got there, and I suppose if one of the things comes out is we all kind of know what a school is, but it can be conceptualized differently, and how they do things differs. Fab. So that's probably a good point to stop for a quick comfort break. So I'm just going to pause recording, the recording back again. I'm going to go back on to there. So realistically then, we were thinking about schools. We all got an idea of what schools are and what they do, but contextually it's different and similar at the same time. So I'm now going to ask you to go on to a second Padlet. So again, famous last words, QR code, Padlet link should work, but it's also on the Canvas page just underneath the one that you've already done. And this time there are 4 questions that I'd like you to think about, and again there's no right answer to these. If you want to do these individually you can, or maybe if you want to split into 2 groups, that's also fine as well. So 4 questions this time, again no right or wrong answer. So the first question is, we've thought about schools on that last slide. The second one now then is, how would you define education? So again, without looking at a dictionary, I think this is quite a difficult one to answer really. However, I would say you've probably got elements of this in your last kind of posts. It was thinking about development, it was thinking about learning, it was thinking about something. And what I would say, I suppose, if we look at the root of the word education, it comes from Latin, and there are these two aspects that come to it: educare, to bring up or rise up, and educere, I think that's how it's pronounced, to lead or draw out. And maybe those things are looking at education from a slightly different perspective. So if we think about educare, to bring up or rise up, potentially we could look at this as being all learners are kind of empty vessels to some extent when they start school, and the purpose of education is to fill them up with something so that they are brought up or they rise up in terms of knowledge and skills. The alternative then is educere, which is maybe to lead or draw out. So maybe rather than seeing all children as individual empty vessels, maybe it's a recognition that all learners have got different skills and interests. And maybe our job in education is to find those skills and those interests within learners and to help develop or lead those out. Or maybe it's some kind of combination of both of those things, potentially. Alright, so how would you define education? As I said, I think that's quite a hard one to verbalise. The second question, once you've defined education, what do you think the purpose of education is, or could be, or should be? And again, I think you've answered this to some extent on the last one. Okay, but again, this, if you kind of Google that, there's all sorts of answers that come up. And just to complicate things, for example, right now I am aware that I'm a lot older than all of you, right? So I was born in 1974, I started primary school in 1978, I'm guessing. I started secondary school in 1985, I finished my A-levels in 1992, most of you are still not born at that point. So I went through a particular school system, right, comprehensive education system. I just went to my local secondary school because that was the only choice. Thinking about a child born in 2026, they're not going to start school until 2030. They're not going to finish school until 2044. And if the retirement age stays as it is, they're going to be working until at least 2094 and are going to live until the 22nd century. Okay, so thinking about that learner or that child's life journey, what is the purpose of education for those learners? Now, one of the things that people always say, and this is right, we want to support children to get skills, to get jobs when they're older. Brilliant. Okay, how many jobs, thinking about even in your childhood, still exist today? Right. Were there jobs, thinking about parts of Wales, for example, that your parents or grandparents did that no longer exist? Okay, how do we know that what we're teaching a child in 2038 is going to be beneficial for them when they live into the 22nd century? So what's the purpose of education? The third task, do you think the purpose is or should be the same for all learners? And I suppose this one depends on how you kind of perceive that. So you could go, yes, it should be the same, but maybe what it looks like for learners is different. Or maybe is there an argument that the purpose for some learners is different to others? And then the final question, which again starts to link a bit more to inclusion, should all learners be offered the same education? Okay, and I've been quite deliberate in terms of semantics there by putting the word same rather than equivalent or equitable, for example. Alright, so you've done a lot of thinking this morning about schools. What do they look like? How do they work? What we're thinking a little bit now is a bit more broad. What is education? What's the purpose of it? Should it be the same for all learners? Should all learners be offered the same education? And then hopefully we'll move on to make the link between that and inclusion. Okay. So I'll leave that screen up for another minute or so, and then I'll pop the Padlet up and see what people are posting. Okay. You're all very diligent and very quiet, I have to say. I'm not used to that. So whilst you're doing this, feel free to talk amongst yourselves. I'm not saying silence freaks me out, but it kind of does a bit. So, yeah. I think you can back me up here, Flo, when you're working in kind of a behaviour unit. Silence is a little bit.
Yeah, something's going on there.
Yeah, what's going on in the background? You're plotting some kind of coup in the background there, Tia, I don't know. Right. No. Okay, so I'm going to pop up onto this Padlet here then. Okay, so I've arranged this one slightly differently, so it's in kind of levels rather than columns. Okay, so again, I'm just going to pick out some points. So I'm going to do that annoying teacher thing and talk over the top of you whilst you're still thinking and doing stuff. So definition of education, so it's something to do with the development of the individual. So an expectation that if you've been through education, you are going to be different, you're going to have developed in some way compared to when you started. Okay, so personally, emotionally, developmentally, cognitively, so that kind of recognition that you might develop in different ways. It's not just about learning academic things. And I think that's a nice point, linking to individuals' best interests and also respecting, I like that word, their capacity. It's the process of learning. Okay, so thank you, Tia. So it's active. We don't just kind of sit there and absorb knowledge like a solar panel. We have to be actively engaged in doing something. So it's a process of learning. We receive information, but as well as just receiving it, we have to do something with it, maybe. A recognition that all children have different abilities and needs, and we need to adapt to those. Thank you very much. Alex again mentioned the process of learning. Yeah, so it's active. It doesn't just happen passively. We have to be involved. We might gain new perspectives. Okay, so that's a nice point. It's not just what we learn, it's how we think and how we perceive things. We have experiences. That's a nice one. And then the dapper finch. You were a mongoose earlier on, Jess, I think, weren't you? Yeah, so you've changed species. So an education to develop learning, social and emotional skills. Brilliant. Okay, so some form of development. You're going to come out of education as an active process, different, changed in some way to when you started. Fab. So the purpose of education. Okay, so not the same for all learners. Alright, so there might be a collective goal of working towards development, but these might be different because capacities are different. Expected outcomes might be different. We need to respect and encourage the development of all learners to meet their needs. Okay, or the purpose of education to support children to develop social, emotional, cognitive and physical development, contribute to society. Okay, so a recognition that there is a goal, there is a reason for going to school or in education, because you will be an adult that's been through education at the end of it. Okay? You will have a part to play in society, reaching full potential, providing opportunities, and you've mentioned that bit there as well, Tia, that this is particularly important for those learners who might be disadvantaged in some way. Okay, so we'll look at Wales in a few weeks' time and think about, Wales as a country is relatively economically deprived. Parts of Wales are amongst the poorest parts of Europe, for example. That does have an impact on the experiences and opportunities that children have. Alex, you mentioned, bless you, enabling students to gain new perspectives, so there is a recognition that of helping children to be able to engage. So emotional, physical skills, providing opportunities, and I think that links very much to what Tia was saying about the disadvantaged, giving opportunities to children and young people who might otherwise not have known that those opportunities existed. Okay, that's a really nice point. And then the purpose of education will vary between learners. Okay, so you've made the link specifically there to Wales, Jess, and thinking about the purposes and the curriculum, for example. So developing learning, keeping people safe, learning different skills, being able to engage in society, so a wide range, and we've got a bit of a mix, I suppose. Yes, there are common purposes for education, all children to be helped to develop and achieve, but maybe that looks different, as you said, Flo, for different learners. So the ultimate goal might be the same, but it might look different for different children and young people. Is the purpose of education the same? So we've kind of got, yes it is, in the sense that it helps develop and it helps socialisation, but no it isn't, because different individuals have different likes and dislikes, different career aspirations, go to specific schools because of specific opportunities. Alex, very strong here, not the same for all. Okay, so you've been quite strident in your opinion there. So different, individuals will have different ideas for the purposes of their education. Okay, potentially that might link to what people mentioned on that previous point about people's experiences and what they know and what opportunities that are available to you in your local area, for example. And then Tia as well, you said the purpose of education is not the same for all learners, because people have got different needs and challenges and strengths and interests that they're bringing into this active engagement. Okay. And finally, this one is a little bit contentious at times. Should all learners receive the same education in the same type of setting? Okay, so Flo, no. Okay, so education means different things for different people. There's no one-size-fits-all approach. Therefore, making everyone learn in the same way, in the same type of setting, isn't good. And Alex, you've got, so I'm just scanning through, education should be more individualised to people's needs, recognition that we're all different, therefore different types of settings might meet the needs of different individuals, so very pragmatic as well. And then Dapper Finch, no, it's different for everyone. Therefore we need to be flexible and adaptable in terms of the approaches, and I think that's a really good question you pose at the end there. Is it even possible for all learners to receive the exact same education regardless of setting? And then Tia, thank you. All learners should receive the same education in the sense that it's meaningful and equal, but outcomes and how they get there might be different in terms of that. So yes, I think it's that word same is problematic. If we'd kind of gone, all children should have an equitable education, I think we'd probably all say yes to that. One of the things we look at, I suppose, in terms of definitions shortly is that word same, which is problematic. Okay, so thank you very much for posting all of that this morning. So realistically, you've debated 4,500 years of education in about 45 minutes. And what we've seen there is that there are some commonalities of thought, but there are differences as well. So no one right answer, but potentially, depending upon where you live, learners are being kind of put into a system which, better or worse, does link to their interests and needs. So thank you very much for posting those. So I'm going to go back onto the PowerPoint. So we've gone through those. So realistically then, type in that question into Google. Here are just some things that came up. So I think there's a lot of things here that link to you'd said. Right, this first one, a little bit highbrow. To bring people to as full a realisation as possible of what it is to be a human being. Wow. So I think realistically they were looking at helping people to develop to be the best that they can be. I think this one's quite nice. Give people the skills to be able to drive their own education. So quite a few of you talked about education was a process and it was active. Actually, one of the things schools might be really needed in is helping children to learn so that they have got the abilities to learn and take that through the lifespan, for example. To develop non-subject life skills. Okay, I think that's a really interesting one. We're starting to see kind of things in the press at the moment now about, you know, what should we teach in numeracy, for example, how to open a bank account, how does interest work, to understand your pay packet and tax, how do you do a mortgage, you've bought a house and the tap isn't working, how do you fix that? So all those kind of non-academic life things which as an adult you're expected to just know, do we have those? To impart powerful subject knowledge. So a recognition that some subjects have got knowledge or facts that they should deliver. But who says what those facts and knowledge should be? And do those change? Okay, so history, I mentioned earlier on, is quite a contentious subject. When we're thinking about history, people have got different perceptions towards history. Thinking about things like the British Empire, for example, was taught in one particular way in education for decades, thinking about the benefits. However, increasingly that recognition of, you know, what there were challenges and the impact that's had on previous colonised countries, for example. Okay, so subject knowledge. Gain knowledge and skills to function in society. I think you mentioned that, Tia. Necessary skills to become productive citizens. And one of the things I think we all probably use is social media, for example. Many Scandinavian countries, in particular Sweden and Denmark and Norway, are introducing into their curriculum supporting children to understand fake news. Supporting people to understand sources and bias so that people just aren't blindly regurgitating misconceptions and myth-truths, for example. So as a skill, I suppose that's always been important. We would have seen that in kind of the press and on TV in the past. However, our lives have changed. Okay, and then I just finish off on this point. 3 purposes: empowering young people to succeed in the economy, so to support people to get a job and become self-sufficient perhaps, participate in culture, and leave school prepared for adult life. So I do quite like that at the end there. I think that encapsulates a lot of the things that you've said in your post this morning. So, just want to mention very briefly now, I apologise, some of you have seen this slide with me at least once before, but when we think about inclusion, inclusion is a debated topic, which is one of the reasons why it's the first assignment choice in terms of the essay, for example, because we don't agree on what it means and we don't agree on how we do it. But what we've kind of got in terms of this slide, I'm really sorry, I can't remember where I got this diagram from, but I think this sets out these particular support strategies quite well, realistically. Now, what we've got on this screen, this, not quite a circle, what's that posh word, an ellipsis perhaps, so that almost circular blue shape, we're going to say that refers to mainstream school. So the everyday primary, secondary school in your local town, for example. We're going to say those green dots represent so-called normal learners. And I'm taking terminology from kind of the 1910s there. So those learners who don't have a need So as a shorthand, normal learners, and then those kind of triangles and squiggles and zigzags, those then were learners who today we would say have got additional learning needs. Okay, so when we think about education systems, so this I think gives a nice overview very briefly of education systems in the UK. Starting off in the 1870s, we had the introduction of formal education to the age of 10, and then it was introduced a couple of years later, formal education to the age of 11, which didn't go down particularly well with factory owners, for example. And the purpose of introducing formal education at that time was to kind of support basic literacy and numeracy, to ensure that the kind of industrial output of the UK didn't fall further behind that of America. So it was giving people skills to go and work in manufacturing and go and work in industry to power the British economy, was the kind of the purpose of education at the time. And what we saw was those normal non-ALN children were expected to go to school until they were 11, and then those learners who didn't fit that normal category, they were excluded in the sense that schools didn't see a place for those learners. For whatever reason, there's no point in that child coming to school, they're not going to be able to learn. Recognition that over time then that was inappropriate, and during the kind of the 19-teens, so from about 1912 going into the 1920s, we started to see what I suppose we would see today as being segregated education. So the big blue circle, mainstream school for mainstream learners. What we now started to see was those weird and wonderful squiggles and triangles who weren't in education previously are now given access to education, but it's separate. So what we started to see was the growth of special schools, and potentially these schools had almost more of a welfare focus rather than education. A lot of these special schools were actually run and operated by local health authorities rather than education authorities, for example. So maybe a recognition perhaps that some of these children and young people had different needs, therefore it's important that those needs are met, but maybe those needs were being met somewhere different. From the 1980s onwards, we start to see an increase in integration. So we've still got those non-mainstream learners with that border around them, but we can see that they've now been brought inside mainstream education. So here we might be thinking about that mainstream secondary school, for example, that's got a special class as part of it, or that school that's got a nurture group, or that school in Swansea that's got an STF, a specialist teaching facility for learners with ASD or hearing impairment, for example. So those learners are now all within mainstream education, but there is still that element of separation of those learners within mainstream school, and then inclusion in many of the definitions looks like this. Okay, so all learners together in mainstream school, potentially in the same class together without those borders around them. However, as a couple of you said on that previous post, is that doable for all learners, and is that actually appropriate for all learners? And potentially, whether it is or not comes down to our definition of inclusion. So arguably, I think we could probably all agree that that isn't inclusion, because some learners are getting access to education and some are not. However, in each of those other three, all learners are accessing education in different ways. So in one sense, yes, those learners are separate, but are they being included, even though they're separate? And I know, Flo, you've got strong opinions, as do I, in terms of that, for example. Are learners there being segregated because they're separate to some extent? Are they being integrated? Are they being included? Are there some learners there? Yes, they're all together in the same school and same class, but will there be learners whose needs are not being appropriately met? Therefore, are they being excluded within that sense? So it's a little bit more complex in practice, possibly. Just wanted to mention now and again, some of you seen this slide previously, I do apologise. We did say that for many learners, originally there was no expectation of education, but there have always been special settings, and some special settings also predated mainstream school as well. And if we look at some of the names that are on the slide here, we can see very often things in terms of blind or visual impairment. I like the names of some of these. The College for the Blind Sons of Gentlemen, for example, which is now the RNIB kind of headquarters school in Worcester. And then we can see things like the Cripples Home, an industrial school for girls. Now, I don't think we could set up an institution today set up for that particular purpose or that particular name. However, at the time, that terminology was seen as being appropriate. And then I just mentioned this one, for example, which is this building up here, the Earlswood Asylum for Idiots and Imbeciles, as it was known at the time. Okay, now when we think about the word asylum, very often we think about that in terms of migration today. Seeking asylum, that's safe space. So very often that recognition that these settings weren't just offering education, they were offering that safe space to maybe challenged, disadvantaged learners as well. Okay. So what do we mean by inclusion? Now, there's no one right answer to this. There's no one definition. Just mention these briefly. So this first one comes from the Warnock report from 1978. This was a landmark report from Mary Warnock which introduced special educational needs and informed education policy in particular in the 80s and 90s, and to some extent today as well. Before the Warnock report, we talked about children being handicapped. Okay, this replaced handicapped to special educational needs. Two others that are on here, the UNESCO one from 2005 talks about inclusion as being a process. Okay, so a lot of you mentioned process in terms of education. And the important point from this definition is the last bit. It's the responsibility of the regular system to educate all children. In other words, all children in that definition, I suppose, is this. All children together in the same place. And then I've gone the wrong way. And then this bottom one from the Welsh Government. Okay, again, inclusion is a process, but I quite like this bit at the bottom. It involves much more than the placement of a child or young person in a mainstream or a special school. Okay, so just because you go to your local secondary school, it doesn't necessarily mean that you are being included. You might go to a pupil referral unit or an alternative unit. You might be educated at home. You might be educated in a special school. Doesn't necessarily mean that you are excluded or segregated. Okay. I'm going to skip a few slides. I'm just going to kind of finish off today in terms of this. Okay, terminology and labels. Now, as I said, I'm old enough to kind of remember my mum saying things like this: sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. However, I'm sure we can all agree that words and terminology and labels are really powerful and have a lifelong impact on people potentially. I really like this quote. Okay, and this is kind of indicative of the plants in my office, for example. If a plant was wilting, we wouldn't diagnose it with wilting plant syndrome. What we would do would be to look to change its conditions. So that plant on my filing cabinet looks like that. It's not because it's a wilting plant, it's because I haven't put it in the best position and conditions to thrive. Why then do we spend a lot of time and effort looking at labelling learners to inform support? Okay. So what we've got on the board here are just some examples of labels. Again, some of you have seen this previously, I apologise. All of these labels were official terms that children could be identified with. Some of these are a little bit more historical now. Probably the worst one on there was idiot. So an IQ of less than 30, so an expectation that you lacked the mental capacity to look after yourself and potentially you were a danger to yourself or others. And what we would do with such learners would be to lock them up in an institution like the Earlswood Asylum. So we will separate those children, we will put them somewhere else because they could be a danger, they could be an impact to other people. Others that we've got, feeble-minded, educationally subnormal, mentally retarded. Okay, did anybody, what's her name? Rosie Jones, the comedian, got into, she's got cerebral palsy. She got into trouble last year because she did a documentary programme entitled Am I a Retard? Okay, and she had massive backlash because some people went, you can't use that phrase because you've got a physical disability, not a mental disability. So what she was trying to do was kind of reclaim the power of that terminology and use it for good, but actually a lot of people really came down hard on it in terms of using it inappropriately. And Ricky Gervais came up with kind of a nice answer to that in terms of she wasn't attacked for using the phrase retard, she was attacked for being the wrong type of retard, which was his terminology, but I think he made a really good point in terms of that. And then we've got other labels, we don't use some of these anymore. Social, emotional and behavioural difficulties, to some extent we now think about mental health challenges, for example. No child is uneducable. And then perhaps one of the newer ones on there, neurotypical. Okay, we see this a lot in terms of kind of neurodivergence and neurotypical. Okay, so over the next few weeks or so we're going to think a little bit about some of these terms and labels. Just some examples of previous labels people might have had. Okay, maladjusted. This was a label that children in the 1970s had who today we would see as having mental health needs. Okay, so those children who were deemed by society to have chosen to be naughty. They know the difference between right and wrong, but they've chosen to be naughty. Therefore, it's their fault. Okay, so not many terms on there, I would say, that can be seen as positive. Okay, some of them, I suppose, we could look at and go, well, yes, if you are deaf, you are deaf. But some of those particularly challenging. Okay. Just put a couple of slides on there if you want to kind of follow that up in terms of the Warnock report. Now, I did say at the start that I was going to set you off on a couple of tasks between now and next Monday if you get the chance to do them. If you do, fab. If you don't worry. All right. So the first one is to think a little bit about your session plan. So maybe think about what kind of age range your made-up class is going to be and what your topic might be. All right. The second one is, if you get a chance to do this, I've put up a discussion point on Canvas and I've put a link on here to a chapter. So it's an ebook chapter that's on the reading list, and basically David Mitchell has put up on there 16 different statements about inclusion being kind of contentious. And what I'd like you to do, if you get a chance, is just have a very quick scan through them. Maybe pick one of those propositions, so one that you feel strongly about, either positively or negatively, and then basically just pop a quick post up onto that discussion about what your thoughts of it are. Okay, but as I said, this is it'd be nice if you get a chance to do it rather than you've got to do it. And the reason I will pop some of these discussion post activities up as we go through is potentially you can look back on anything you post and it might help in terms of the essay choice at the end of the module. Alright, so just to finish off, thinking about some of the propositions he'd noted. So proposition 1 Inclusive education extends beyond special needs and includes considerations of other disadvantage, including poverty, language, ethnicity and geographical location. I think that's a nice point. Second one, inclusive education is complex and problematic. Yeah, maybe. Let's have a look. Proposition 7, inclusion goes beyond education and should consider employment, recreation, health and living conditions. So maybe we spend a lot of time thinking about inclusion in school, but we think of it as only being an education thing. Should we also be thinking about equitable access to employment opportunities, leisure opportunities, housing opportunities, for example? Okay, so I will stop talking in a second, as I think we will get kicked out of here shortly. But realistically today, then, you've spent a bit of time, thank you very much for all those posts, thinking about what's the point of sending children to school, what's the purpose of education. We've very, very briefly touched on inclusion, and does that mean all children together in the same school, or could it be wider than that? And then we've very briefly mentioned some examples of different labels. What we'll think a little bit next week about is different types of settings. We'll think a little bit more about labels as well, and then for the 3 weeks after that we'll focus each week on a different area of need, which may or may not be the need of those learners that you will come across in the test itself. Alright, so other than that, I'll stop talking. Thank you very much for coming in this morning.